Welcome everyone to this video. So today what I'd like to talk about briefly is this concept of intention or intentionality, or what we often hear in the yoga context is the setting of an intention. And what I'd like to clarify before I start, and I think this probably applies to almost everything that I talk about unless it's very, very specific to a specific aspect of yoga, such as asana, movement, or breathing, is that any concepts that we hear in relation to yoga are not just designed to support our practice on the mat. They are actually far-reaching tenets or systems that, if we choose to do so, we can practice in every aspect of our lives. So for most of us, we may be familiar with the idea of setting an intention because perhaps our teacher at the beginning of a class or close to the beginning of a class says, let us set an intention for the class. And sometimes this is given a free rein. So the idea is that each individual sets an intention for their practice or for the session. Or perhaps with other teachers, they may actually have a specific intention in mind, like compassion or patience or slowness or whatever it might be, in order to help shape and guide the practice. So the question is, to start with, why is it important that we have an intention that accompanies our practice? Well, actually, one of the most interesting things about setting an intention is that in order to set an intention, we actually have to spend a moment thinking or contemplating about, well, what is it that we actually want to get out of this practice? Now, if we just kind of sidestep into any other aspect of our lives, and particularly what might be the professional domain, so for example, the business world or the commercial world or the domain in which we work or earn a living. Now, it would be quite unheard of for a company or for a business or for an organization or a charity, whatever it might be, to act without setting its version of an intention, which actually might be its mission statement, but then that is backed up by a strategy which basically allows them to live with an intentional set of activities and goals and objectives on a day-to-day basis. It would be very unlikely that a company would succeed or would move towards some definition of progress unless the mission statement had been defined and unless some kind of strategy for reaching that goal or objective had been articulated and set down in some way, and of course communicated to the people in that organization. So what's so interesting is that given that we live in a world where there is so much of a focus on the way in which we set intentions in the commercial, professional, business domains, but yet we are so unfamiliar with the practice of actually thinking about, well, what is the strategy for my life? What is the intention for my life? What is the intention, even on a smaller basis, for my practice? And the reason that perhaps this may not be familiar to us is because perhaps it's not something that we have ever given thought to, and it's not something that maybe we allow space for in our lives. Now, what yoga helps to teach us through this simple idea of setting an intention in our practice is that if, for example, and to continue a theme of recent videos, that our intention is to cultivate peace and to connect to that place within us that is fundamentally peaceful, well then at the beginning of the practice we offer up that our intention is to cultivate peace throughout the practice. And that will have ramifications, that will have implications for the way in which we practice. If we're trying to cultivate peace, we're not going to do a really, really physically intensive practice that maybe disturbs our mind, that maybe disturbs our breath and leaves us feeling completely exhausted and out of breath at the end of the practice. Similarly, if we want to cultivate peace, we're not going to do really, really long, intense breath holds in our pranayama practice when we're not ready for them. Because again, that will create tension in the body, and similarly, that tension will translate and accumulate in the mind as well. So what we can see through this simple example is that by setting an intention, it creates a framework for the way that we act within our practice. Now, if we broaden out the concept and we bring the intention off the mat and into our lives. And by the way, actually a great intention is one that can bridge both of those areas, because of course yoga is about bringing everything together and having that ability to see things holistically. Well, of course, if we're practicing one intention on the mat, it makes logical sense that we would like that then to be the ground or the basis for the way in which we live. So for example, one intention might be, I would like to help to cultivate relationship in a more deep and compassionate way. And when we talk about relationship, we can say this is the relationship between ourselves and our minds, ourselves and our bodies, ourselves and our breath, but then also ourselves and the world around us, ourselves and other people, perhaps our family, perhaps our friends, perhaps our pets, perhaps our environment, perhaps other people that we don't know so well in our community, maybe charities and so on and so forth. So if we set the intention that each and every day we would like to improve relationship in our lives, well, then that actually gives us a framework into which we can look at the world and we can look at our activities. So one aspect of cultivating relationship or improving relationship is the ability to be compassionate for ourselves and others. So we may actually say, okay, my intention is to live as compassionately as I can today. That means taking time to listen and to be with other people, not to rush myself, to take breaks where I need. There are many, many aspects of how compassion can arise on a moment-to-moment basis, both in terms of how we treat ourselves and how we treat others. Now imagine if every morning, before we move, before we get out of bed, before we leave for work or school or for college or for studies or whatever it might be, we just take a moment to sit down somewhere quiet, or perhaps even lying in our bed, and we just take a few seconds or a minute or two to cultivate in our minds, to talk ourselves through today, as I wake, as I intend to go through my day, I would like to cultivate an intention to be compassionate both to myself and to others. I'm going to try to notice how I'm feeling and adapt my day accordingly. I'm going to try to notice how other people are responding to me, and I'm going to see if I can be with them in the most compassionate way that I'm able to in this given moment of time. And that could be the way in which we frame and set up our day. Similarly, towards the end of the day, we may also like to undertake an exercise where we just non-judgmentally just review our day, and we notice whether that intention actually was able to be with us in a sustained manner throughout the course of our actions, activities, words and deeds and so forth. And then maybe we also finish that intention by saying we also intend to bring this practice into the next day. May we sleep soundly so that we can wake full of energy and determination to continue our practice of bringing this intention into our lives. So we can see just from this small example that the way that we can use intention in our lives can be very, very powerful indeed. But of course, as with everything in yoga, the practice actually does start on the mat, or in this case, it starts in the morning when we just set aside some time to be with our intention, to feel into our intention, and to allow that intention to bloom and to blossom into our lives. It's only by setting aside that time in the morning and perhaps in the evening that we train ourselves to keep coming back to that idea of intention setting, so that when we go through our day, maybe we actually then begin to notice when we're not being so compassionate in the moment. And therefore, because we have the framework and the reference point of the intention that we set in the morning, it can help us to quickly recalibrate the way in which we're behaving to ourselves or others and smooth our day ahead, rather than perhaps being unconscious of the way that we're behaving and therefore causing damage to ourselves and others. A final point, which is that actually we may set an intention at the beginning of an asana practice, which could also be, how am I compassionate to myself as I practice? That means I'm not going to push myself too hard, I'm going to pay attention to my body, I'm going to be kind to my breath. I'm just going to notice, I'm going to take breaks where they're necessary. The point I'd like to make here is that we don't just want to set the intention at the beginning of the practice, we actually want to keep connecting back to that intention throughout the practice, to keep it in mind and to keep that framework alive throughout our practice, rather than something that we just do at the beginning and maybe we reconnect to at the end. In the same way as I just described, we can practice this in our day-to-day lives by coming back into the connection with this intention time and time again, and seeing perhaps over the space of weeks or months how, by living with this practice of setting an intention on a daily basis, it can bring true transformation to our lives. So as with all of these topics, please do experiment, contemplate, and see how you can bring them into your own lives. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing you again very soon. Thank you. Namaste.